Part 2. Inside the shaman's hut, Arnaq witnessed more evidence of Hotchganuk's power. Sumerian women toiled about the hut. They bore bruises and scars that told of long abuse and broken spirits. They refused to meet Arnaq's gaze and were given a plain garment with no adornments. Around each slave's neck there was a leather collar with loops. At their wrists and ankles additional leather bracers with loops were strapped on. It was not difficult for Arnaq to imagine what the loops were for, and it disgusted him. Pigs took slaves in battle from other tribes, and those females that were taken were forced to accept new male mates, but the manner in which the Crow were inflicting it upon these women, even though they were the hated Sumerians, offended Arnaq's sense of Pictish honor. Hotchganuk sat upon the Aquilonian camp chair. He wore a traditional cloak of crow feathers, and his hair was tied back into a long braid decorated with crow feathers as well. His body, though, was wrapped in a fine silk tunic and a golden gorget from lands far to the south. The old shaman still looked virile and healthy, no doubt the result of his herbal knowledge. Live crows sat on his shoulders and patiently waited to do the shaman's bidding, and at his feet a large mountain lion dozed contentedly. "Hello, Arnaq, slayer of the red bears, hunter of the cave bears, and first amongst the hunters of his kind," the shaman bid him. "So, we are to have a show of propriety, eh?" Arnaq thought. "Very well, magic man." Arnaq bowed his head before replying. "Surely you are Hotchganuk, the mighty shaman who dealt the Sumerians such heavy woes." "I am. Sit, please. I am aware that you were once wroth with me and suspicious. I regret that I had to send your fellow hunter to the ancestors, but you must see that I am mighty, and I can make good on what it is I have brought you here to discuss. But first—" The shaman pointed to one of the slave girls, and then to a trunk that rested against the wall of his hut. The girl opened the trunk and brought him a pipe wrapped in a cloth, as well as a bag of tobacco. The shaman checked to be sure that the stone bowl of the pipe was clear of any obstructions. He inserted it and its reed into the stem of the pipe. He packed the bowl of the pipe and raised it to the ceiling. This motion thanked the ancestors and totems for the gift of insight and prayer. Then he lit the tobacco he had packed into the bowl and took 3 long draughts from the pipe. He handed the pipe to Arnaq, who was required to also smoke. This ritual ensured that no harm would come to the speakers while they were guests in the other's domain. Arnaq inhaled the smoke and handed the pipe back to the shaman. "You, Arnaq, are a mighty warrior who has fought the Vanir. You are familiar with how to defeat men in heavy metal armor," the shaman said. "It is true," Arnaq agreed. Good. It is as I have heard," said Hotchganuk excitedly. "Since our last battle, the Sumerians are rushing to their production of better armor and weapons. Soon not even their poorest farmer will lack a shirt of mail and a stout shield to hide behind. I have even heard rumors that their tactic of making a long line of men is being changed. They are rumored to be shifting their tactics of fighting like men, and instead adopting the effete Aquilonian methods of war." Arnaq nodded, though he disagreed with Hotchganuk's opinion about the Aquilonians. Aquilonia had conquered her neighbors and was, perhaps, the most potent foe of the Hyborian nations. All that kept the Aquilonians from advancing through Pictland was their religion, which was nominally pacifistic, and their rulers' disagreement about how to prosecute an invasion. The news of the Sumerians' changing tactics, however, was disturbing to Arnaq. The Sumerians favored fighting in a looser formation than the Aquilonians. They relied more on individual skill in battle and being closer to the foe than the southern conquerors favored. Yet the southern way of war, with very tightly packed formations, interlinking shields, and the preference of long spears and javelins, had proven very effective. Arnaq doubted if any Pictish warband could defeat a Sumerian one if the Sumerians changed their tactics in imitation of the Aquilonian ones. The Picts had managed some successes in battle against the legions, but only at night and with ambush. The bulk of their success had come from poisoning water sources and diseases inflicted upon the conquerors by the Pictish shamans. And still, each year, the Aquilonians crept closer. Along the coast it was the reverse. Each year the Zingarians and Argosians, and the Vanir, who had attempted to set up colonies there, lost a settlement, and slaves flowed across Pictland from the west to the east. Arnaq had traded the foreign women to other Picts who paid high prices for them. The foreigners were often taller, slighter of limb, unstooped, and beautiful. "I do not understand how what the Sumerians are doing requires my expertise," Arnaq prompted. "The Vanir fight a bit like the Sumerians and a bit like the Aquilonians. Is that not so?" Hotchganuk asked. "It is true that the Vanir do fight the Aquilonians are said to when they first go on the attack, but they soon lose their cohesion as their battle lust takes hold," Arnaq said. "But I think I see why you wish for my advice. You believe that the Cimmerians will still fight like the Vanir, and that my experience in defeating them will prove useful to you. Exactly. With your aid at how to bait the Cimmerians out of their formations, we can easily lead them to their doom. Why, we could even be set to make a march all the way to their great stone by which they swore in their forgotten kings. Imagine every spear and picklin raised against the Blackmanes. We could enslave the entire race in the span of a generation. A defeat of our foe for all time, the shaman prattled on. Your voice is filled with the kind of lust a man has for a new maiden. But tell me, Hotchganuk, who will the Picts turn their spears on when none dare come close to their land? Of all the foes we face, the Cimmerians are the mightiest. They make us stronger. Without them, will we not turn upon each other and grow feeble from having to war with lesser men? Arnaq thought. But aloud, he said what he hoped his captor wished to hear. It truly would be a mighty deed, a song to be sung for ages to come. I am intrigued. But tell me, why is it you have not simply asked the other chieftains and councils to listen to your plan? Arnaq asked. The Lackards do not wish to join the work until they are assured of the victory. Twice now I have sent forth my vision to them, and they have returned with replies of, next year perhaps, or we must train more hunters for the fray. I secretly think they wish to see the Crow expend their strength alone, then step in like Stygians and steal the spoils for themselves, Hotchganuk said. At the mention of the vile Stygians, both he and Arnaq spat in disgust. But if you would join me with, say, 100 of your warriors taught to teach others how to fight these blocks of men, then the other tribes would have no excuse to hide behind contributing to the effort, Hotchganuk said. In return, I will see to it that the Osprey receives the choicest slaves taken from the war. Arnaq pondered. You must have already had forays into the east that are unknown, and the Cimmerians beat back because they have changed tactics. This is why you wish for me. That, or perhaps you are worried that, seeing a weaker Cimmeria, the Aquilonians will march north and steal land from the Blackmanes from behind. You are wise in more than magic, Hotchganuk, and should I refuse, doubtlessly you will have your animals slay me. I need time to consider an escape, but you have not left me many options. Unless... The Cimmerian blacksmith you have toiling with you, I will need to spend a fortnight with him, examining his craft and his skill, before I can give you an answer, Arnaq said. I need to know how Cimmerian armor and weaponry, as well as their character, measures against the Vanir. I have never fought the Cimmerians before, and it would be folly to advise you on something of which I know nothing. The shaman stroked his chin. It was not the answer he had wished for, yet he could find no way around the logic of it. Very well, Hotchganuk said. Until then, take 2 slaves from my retinue, and use them however you will, as well as the hut on the southern border of the camp. Arnaq decided to press his advantage. I have heard that you have one particularly appealing slave, an Argosian woman with snow-white hair. The shaman smirked and said, any but her, Arnaq. She is special to the spirits, and can only be approached by magic men and worthy men at special times. But perhaps after you give me your answer... Indeed, Arnaq agreed. He rose and tapped 2 of the women who were kneeling on the hut floor upon their shoulders, and said, I will borrow these. Not at all, friend Arnaq. Take them. I can afford to be generous, Hotchganuk said. Yes, your success in war is evident. I thank you, my gracious host, Arnaq replied. Then he and his 2 new slave women left the hut of the shaman. Hotchganuk was not fooled for a moment about Arnaq's will being quelled. I have let you keep your life, offered you booty, and given you 2 fine Cimmerian wenches, and still you dawdle. Ungrateful osprey, I should have fed you to the gods. Yet I need your voice to raise spears, Hotchganuk thought. He motioned for one of his slaves to attend him. She crawled to him, eyes downcast, on the floor. The shaman undid his breechcloth before the slave who, having been often beaten, and her spirit having long since been broken, applied herself to the task commanded. She knew from past experiences that the shaman preferred to delay his pleasure, so she performed her task slowly and delicately. While she was occupied, Hotchganuk rested back in his camp chair and began to consider what it was he could do to further pressure the hunter to do his bidding. If the show of magical might and the appeal to his greed did not convince Arnaq to do what was best for Hotchganuk's plan, then a new motivator would be needed. Hotchganuk was sure that the spirits would give him a sign. He grabbed the Cimmerian slave cruelly by her hair and dragged her to his bed. He took pleasure in beating her before he used her, While Hotchganuk used the woman, he allowed himself the fantasy that she was all the women of Samaria, and he all the men of Pickland. Arnaq walked through the camp with his new slaves behind him. The men looked at him with some envy. He thought, I will have to be careful, or envy will get me slain. He walked through the village and made it a point to examine all he saw. The many children that were running around were being cared for by slaves. This was not very effective. As he passed by a hut, Arnaq saw one of the boys beating his Sumerian caretaker with a switch, and another a boy was mischievously destroying the attempts of a slave to prepare food. Arnaq was sure she would be beaten for not completing her task. He was sure the boy knew this and was taking glee in it. Everywhere Arnaq looked, he beheld a confusing vista. He was surrounded by the sights and smells of a proper Pict village, and yet everything felt wrong. His gaze met one of the elderly Pictish women's look. A look of intense regret dwelt there. She was alone, with no younger women to aid her. Her hands pounded meal with a stone mortar and pestle. She looked on the verge of tears. Everything here is twisted. An elder allowed to languish? The children allowed to run amok? Arnaq thought. He took care to keep his tongue still. The hut that Hotchganuk had set aside for him was large. It had already been decorated and given sleeping mats. Arnaq stepped inside and the two women followed him. He shut the leather flap that served as the door of the hut, and he sat down on the furs that covered the bed. Light filtered into the hut through the smoke hole at the top of the hut's frame. He looked at the women. They were waiting for his instructions. Sit, he commanded them, and they did so. He could not decide if he could trust them. They were captives, and their instinct would be to manipulate and lie. You were raised together? He asked them. They seemed unsure of how to answer. It occurred to Arnaq that they must not speak a great deal of Pictish yet. He simplified his sentences. You know each other. You were children together, he asked. Recognition showed upon their countenances. One of the girls nodded. What are your names? Arnaq asked them. We are called Cat and Oak, the girl that had nodded answered. Those are not your real names? Arnaq asked. They shook their heads. Arnaq leaned back. Not only has he stolen them, he is trying to steal away their will. This shaman is not worth his title. It is the same things the Aquilonians try to do to the kinsmen of ours they capture. They try to civilize them and make them demure and unquestioning. When he looked back, he noticed that the slave women had removed their garments and waited for Arnaq to command them. Cat and Oak were lovely enough to look upon, but after what he had realized, they did not move his lust. However, if he did not use them, word would spread amongst the camp that he might be unable. That in turn would mean that the men would be less prone to trust him or aid him. You girls, you have been with men? He asked them. They nodded. Arnaq said, This will be different. Come to me. The women crawled to him on their hands and knees, a behavior they had been whipped into by Hotchganuk. They sat by Arnaq quietly and passively. Gently he laid them back upon the bedding. Then Arnaq began massaging and caressing the women. At first they were tense and unsure of what it was he was doing, but as he applied his touch to them gently, Cat and Oak found themselves responding to him. When he kissed them, he found them willing. Slowly he allayed the fear the slaves had that he was going to be cruel and unkind to them. Outside the hut, passing Pictish warriors looked upon it with wonder, for it was not screams and pleading cries that arose from the tent, but the sounds of two women groaning with need and shouting in release. The sound of actual lovemaking filled the camp. It, too, had been a foreigner there, and had only returned with Arnaq. Grania, the woman the Picts called Oak, lay beside the strange hunter in the crook of his arm. Unlike the other men of the camp, he had taken care to be sure she and her companion were indeed pleased. He was skilled in the arts of love, and something had happened during the joining that she could not explain, a sensation that normally only happened to her in her youth, when she was young and first exploring her own body, had overtaken her. She had felt guilty that this man, who was her enemy, had provoked such a reaction. He had tenderly paused for her, then comforted her as best he could before turning his attention upon Iphi, the woman the Picts called Cat. Grania heard muttering beside them, and assumed that Iphi was speaking in her sleep, but the whispers of the woman that had a hissing and accusatory tone. Silently, Grania listened. No, he did not say, master. I swear. How could I deceive you, master, who controls birds, serpents, and the very air? Of course I am loyal, master. No, master, he is not as manly as you. Yes, master, I am loyal. Yes, master. Yes, master. Iphi whispered. Grania shook in fear. The shaman could hear whispers from those who were loyal to him. Nothing they did was safe. The shaman's eyes were everywhere, and Knifey had become his loyal slave. Grania did not wish to imagine what had been done or promised to turn Ify against her people. Yet so far from the hills of their home, and surrounded by the threat of rape and torture, Grania found she could not blame the woman for falling into docility. Grania cinched her arms around the hunter she slept beside, and hoped her own character would never be so tested.